So it's been a while since we had our last set of talk. I don't remember, maybe it was June or May. I don't quite remember. I think you had a break, and also it sounds like there's going to be less talks than originally planned, so we'll have to fit more material into the few that we have. So it sounds like today will be the last talk on Parchen, Prajna Paramita. So we've covered Simke, Bodhicitta, or what did I call it? The expanded mind. We had 2 talks on that. And then now we've done 2 talks. This is the second one on the Four Noble Truths. I think, though, if we had to choose any topics from all of Prajna Paramita, there's no doubt in my mind that these are the 2 most important. So it's good that we covered these. If you study chapters 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, after studying chapter 1, if you studied about bodhicitta and Four Noble Truths, then you already know about half of the debates that occur again and again, again, the different topics. So with bodhicitta, of course, you get many of the unique qualities of the Mahayana and what makes the distinction to it. And then with the Four Noble Truths, you learn a lot about the meanings of the various terms within the Buddhist framework of, you could say, psychology or cosmology. I don't know what is quite the right word, but things like contamination and ripened effects and wrong engagers, things like this. So then, well, I suppose next talk, it sounds like we're going to move on to Madhyamaka. And actually a little bit of what we talk about today, we'll touch upon some of those themes, so maybe it'll give a good segue into that. So last time when we talked about the Four Noble Truths, we went through 2 of the main debates, which was, or you could say debates, but also just difficult points that are not obvious just from looking at the text, and that really require a lot of detail and distinction between different points. So the first one last time was the order of the Four Noble Truths, which is probably the sort of the standard debate that people do when they debate about the Four Noble Truths. It also will come up if you study the 2nd chapter of Dharmakirti's the Pramana, the valid cognition. And then we talked about what was it? The let me check actually. What was it? Order and anyway, I didn't look through it before, but anyway, someone remembers it. You can look back on it. So this time we have we're going to have one about the 16 aspects. So maybe that was only the second one. Now that I say that, I think we might have had the whole talk last time on different aspects of understanding the order, and then I had a whole bunch of background information that was necessary for that. And then this time, so we'll talk about the next major point, which is the order. So the 16 aspects, and then the wrong engagers that engage them. So as many of you will know, if you study this, that there's the Four Noble Truths, and each of them have 4 aspects, making a total of 16. And that this is presented also from the point of view of the wrong engagers. There are 4 wrong engagers, or really wrong ideas or wrong conceptions, that are the opposite. In some respect, we'll see why that's not exactly that way, but in some respect, the opposite of the 16 aspects, which are ways to counter those. They're the antidote by meditating on these 16 aspects. It helps us to understand more deeply what we really mean when we say suffering, origin, the cessation, and the path. And then we have a few other subjects. I don't think any of them are as major as that, but there are some difficult points that are definitely useful to be going through, because they bring out some of the other things that we might not think about. They might seem obvious at first, but when we look into what it really means, it can be quite difficult. So let's begin. I'll share the screen here. This is the PowerPoint where we left off last time. So this is slide 20, in case I think some of you are using the translation of it. I did make a couple changes today, but very minor, mainly grammatical things. So hopefully whoever translated it into your respective language already fixed those. So we have the 16 aspects and the 16 wrong engagers. I didn't even write the aspects here because I understand that most of you have probably studied them, but it's good that I just list them, at least verbally, so that some of you who might not know, or even if you do, that you hear it again and you can remember. So we start actually with the wrong engagers. That's usually how it's presented. So we have, regarding the truth of suffering, there are 4 wrong engagers. There is thinking that in this case, it's not the truth of the suffering itself, but the appropriating aggregates. That is the basis of what's being observed, the observed object. Appropriating aggregates means the 5 aggregates that constitute a person. And appropriating, in Tibetan, the word nyerlen, it's not clear whether it means appropriating or appropriated, and it actually can mean both. So it's taken on due to past craving and karma, and it becomes the cause for further rebirth. So that's appropriating in that sense. So thinking that the appropriating aggregates are permanent, are actually the first, and the order here, I should change the order. The order in terms of the wrong engagers, we'll explain why it's a little different than the aspects, is that first thinking that the aggregates are clean, and then secondly thinking that they are happiness, and then third that they are permanent, and fourth that they are self. And then the opposite of that, the 16 aspects, which don't quite line up, but I'll explain why. I'll just list them now, is that the aggregates are impermanent, are in the nature of suffering, are empty, and are selfless. And then with the truth of the origin, it's observing the second and the 8th of the 12 links of dependent origination, or so the second and the 10th, I should say. Yeah, second and 8th is right. So it's Duchigi Pompon, which is the conditioning, or what is it? Compounding phenomena, right? Which means, essentially it means throwing karma or impelling karma is the second link. And then the 8th is craving, right? And sometimes actually, that's why I was thinking 10th. Sometimes it's just presented as this 8 and the 10th, which is similar because the 10th is just the continuation of the second one. So the 10th being existence, it's just that same karma ripening at the time of death. But in any case, it just says lei tan yomo, meaning karma and delusion, right? So it's any of those permutations, but yeah, sometimes at least in Dharmakirti, it does say sitse, so meaning that would be the 8th and the 10th, craving and existence. So basically, we can just think of it as karma and affliction, mental affliction. So anyway, thinking. So actually, in terms of the aspects, I get ahead of myself. You start with those. But in terms of the wrong engagers, it's different. We'll also talk about that. So it does not have anything to do, per se, with karma and delusion, because the person who has a wrong engager doesn't know that karma and delusion are the cause of suffering. They think something else is. So it actually, in this case, they observe suffering and think it has no cause. That's the first one. I think we can think about how that might be relevant in today's world. It's not that most people would not say that suffering is completely causeless. They would agree that if I hit myself with a hammer, that hurts. And if I don't do that, it doesn't hurt. So that in some sense, that's the cause of suffering. But that there's no greater cause. There's not something else. There's no meaning to it all. Say there's no meaning of life. There's nothing more than the aggregation of atoms and the evolution of species that results from that. Nothing else more behind all of that in the universe. So in some sense, that's related to this first one of there's no cause of suffering. The second one is that there's only one cause. So that there is a cause, but this view is very narrow. So one way we might think about that, and it depends, of course, upon the subtlety of the person's understanding, but one way that we might think of it, at least in terms of the way some people might approach it, is thinking that the original sin is the cause of suffering, that one person did one bad action a long time ago, and that we're all suffering as a result of that. And then thirdly, that there is karma. Actually, in this third view, they do adhere to the idea of karma. However, it is controlled by some kind of God figure, that there is some God that impels the whole process. So this is the view of a lot of other Indian schools, that karma in and of itself is not the whole story, that there's somebody who decided and created it to be this way. And then fourthly, the view that this is a little harder and more subtle. In Tibetan, it's Rangjin Dakyang Negap Shindigiro, which means it's by its nature permanent, but it occasionally or temporarily changes its aspect. So this is a harder one to grasp. It's often presented as either the view of the Samkhya or of the Jains, although there's not a lot of explanation as to why. We can think about, for example, the Samkhya school believes in the Prakriti, the fundamental essence, which appears in different forms, but everything is really of the same nature. The phenomenal world that we experience is all a manifestation of this same thing that's permanent. It just appears in different aspects. But one way, again, I try to think about it in terms of practically speaking, because this is a very common wrong view, is what I would call karmic fatalism, which is a view that there is karmic effect, but it's fixed, it's permanent. So once an action is done, the result will definitely be experienced. It's all written somewhere in a book, and it's all decided ahead of time what's going to happen, and you can't change it, which is not the Buddhist understanding of karma. So we'll understand when we see the opposite of those, the aspects, the four aspects. So the first one is that so this is where I know we're getting back to my original point, that karma and delusion are a cause. They're the cause of suffering. So there is a cause. And secondly, that they are the origin, which in this context means they give rise to suffering again and again. So in Tibetan, we have the idea of what we call a jungne, which is what this word kunjung comes from. Jung. So a jungne, the jungne in Sanskrit would be kara. It's a source. But in Tibetan grammar, anyway, this is the same in Sanskrit grammar. It's one of the eight grammatical classes. To be an actual, what's called jungne, right, the fifth grammatical class, it has to be something that even when it gives its result, it doesn't expend itself. So a seed gives rise to a sprout. That is not a real jungne in grammar. It's called a puted jungne. It's similar, but it's not the real thing. A better example of a jungne would be a gold mine. You take gold from the mine, but you keep coming back and taking more. So it just keeps giving and giving. So a jungne in this case means something that just keeps giving rise to suffering again and again. It doesn't just turn into suffering and then it's gone. So there's not just one cause. It's not just like first mover that does something and then it's gone. It's something that again and again is involved in the process. And then thirdly, rabke in Tibetan, which means strong production. So this means that it gives rise forcefully. So this is one of the harder ones to parse, to figure out how that's the opposite of the idea of it being controlled by God. I think actually I liked Geshe Tashi's Heading's explanation in his book on the Four Noble Truths. Is better than I saw in most of the traditional text. And he says that it's showing that karma is the whole thing. It is powerful enough by itself. It doesn't need somebody else to come along and control it like a puppeteer. In and of itself, it can give rise to these strong suffering experiences. And then the fourth one, condition. So the condition is specifically talking about craving. It's not in this context, it's not talking about karma. Before it was talking about karma and craving. And the reason is that the karma itself needs to be conditioned by craving. It's not a fixed thing. So then, thirdly, we have the cessation, it's the truth of cessation. So that starts with the first, cessation, gokpa in Tibetan. I never really got a good answer about this. It's a bit strange. The word gokpa in Tibetan is an active particle. Sorry, an active verb, right? So there's two different verbs related. One is ga, to have ceased or to cease. And gok is to cause to cease. It's a bit strange that gokden would be that. It should really be gakden, the truth of cessation. It's not the truth of that which causes to cease. It doesn't, I haven't figured out exactly why that's the case. But in any case, this is what they use. I think Niyarota in Sanskrit, although I don't know. Sanskrit scholars can research that one, how it is in Sanskrit. It doesn't come to mind immediately. So the gokden, but the first one is just simply gokpa. Oh, sorry. I should start with the wrong engagers again, like I did before. So the first wrong engager is that there is no path to liberation. There's no cessation of suffering. There is no liberation. Karpa yimit is in Tibetan. Yime is like completely not. So there is no such thing as liberation from suffering, which is probably the most common view. It goes right hand in hand with what I talked about before, about it just being random. Yes, if I hit myself with a hammer, it hurts. If I don't, it doesn't hurt. But there's no state where I can just be invulnerable and no matter how many times I get hit by a hammer, I don't suffer anymore. Because that's just not the way a human body works. The human body is meant to suffer because that helps us to survive. It's part of survival, and that's why humans exist in this viewpoint. And then secondly, the view that so it's, what is it? Sabjigi ke bragajik tarpa zimpa. So believing that some particular kinds of contamination are liberation, and this is particularly talking about certain states of meditative absorption. So there's, for example, what we call dujimeji mebi nyamjok, which is the absorption without perception, which is not the formless absorption. Don't confuse it with that. It's an aspect of the fourth concentration where somebody enters into a temporary cessation of any conscious mental activity. And they think that this is liberation. There's no more experience at all. They're just entering into kind of non-experience. So the Buddha himself recognized these two and three are the two states that his two earlier teachers had attained, that they taught him. What are their names? Well, anyway, in Tibetan, Lakchi, right? Udraka is a Ramaputra, I think, in Sanskrit. Anyway, these two people, they had to attain these two states, and the Buddha himself recognized when he trained with them and attained them himself, this is not liberation. You think you're liberated, but you're not. And then the third one is similar, but it's more subtle. It's Dugaki Kevrakashik. So certain aspects that are in the nature of suffering are liberation, which is talking about even higher states of concentration. So in this case, like the fourth state of the formless realm. The people there thought that the lower ones aren't liberation, but they've attained the real one. And then finally, thinking that there is liberation, but it doesn't last forever. So you can attain a temporary kind of liberation, and gradually it slides away, and you fall back into samsara, which anyway is presented as the view of the Jains. I'd have to read more about their own views, and I don't know enough about them to comment. We don't meet many Jains here in India. There are some, but I've never really had a discussion with a Jain monk. But in any case, in our traditional text, that's how it's presented, that the Jains believe that there is a kind of heavenly state, because when you purify all of your karma, you're no longer weighed down. And so you float up into this, after death anyway, you float up into this heavenly state, which is like a great white umbrella over the world. And you stay there for a time, but eventually you have to fall back. And it seems to be the view of the Mimamsa school also, which was a Vedic school. That I know a little more about just because from reading Dharma Kirti. A lot of the second half of the first chapter is a debate with the Mimamsa about their view of the Vedas. And likewise, the belief that there is no permanent liberation. This cycle of existence, you can get to some kind of state where it stops for a while, but it doesn't stop forever. So the opposite of that is the four aspects. So that's what I'm getting back to what I said originally. Cessation. It is the cessation of suffering. There is such a thing. So it's what is it is observing. It's observing the abandonment of the view, the conception of a sufficient self. So viewing that and recognizing that is a cessation of suffering. It doesn't have to be nirvana per se. Nirvana is how do we say? Is cessation, but cessation is not necessarily nirvana. We say there's three possibilities, because the path of seeing also you get cessation. And then the second one is jiva, so pure pacification. It's the pacification of affliction. And then the third one, that it is gyanom, so it's sublime. It's sometimes translated that way. So it's a state of bliss and benefit. It's a beneficial state to achieve. Now, how is that the opposite of the other one? It's a bit hard to say, and it might not actually necessarily have to be that. But if it is the opposite, one of my classmates suggested, well, it's that some people might think that just simply ceasing delusion is not enough, that you want to get this blissful state of heaven in an absorption. But this is enough. This in itself is enough. Who wants more than that? The blissful state just to abandon delusion. And then fourthly, the view, the correct view that this abandonment of the conception of self, the substantial self, is nijong. So is definite emergence, right? So this is often translated as renunciation, not engaging itself, but engaging sampa, the determination to attain definite emergence. So nijong, ni is definite, certain, and zhong is to have emerged. So it's definitely free of samsara. It will not fall back. There's some question as to whether some of the Vaibhashika schools contradict this when they believe that actually anahara can deteriorate in their realization. But as it says in the Abhidharma Kosha, what is it? The Chiwa Me, they can't die, right? It means that within this lifetime, if they fall back, then they will certainly get arhat again within this life without dying first. I'm not sure how they know that, but that's the view, the Vaibhashika. That's why, at least part of the reason that Vasubandhu himself rejected that view. And then fourthly, the truth of the path. So that has four wrong conceptions. One is that it's very similar to the cessation. There's no path to liberation. And that there is a path, but that that samdhengi ke pragajik. So particular the first one is that gangzagidagmedo bishera. So that the realization of selflessness is not that path. And then thirdly, that that the certain states of concentration are that path. And then fourthly, that there is a path, but it does not lead to a permanent liberation. So it's similar. So then the opposite of that, lam, drupa, rikpa, Rupa, Drupa, and Ngijin. So it's very similar to the cessation. There's a path, and there's the realization of selflessness is that path. Secondly, that the realization of selflessness is correct. It correctly apprehends the way things are. So it's the opposite of thinking it's wrong. And then thirdly, that it accesses the nature of reality and the nature of the mind. It's achiever, Drupa. It is able to bring liberation because of that, because it gets to the way the mind actually is. It's not something extraneous. And then fourthly, Nijin, which is the active version of the Nijong, which is it brings definite emergence. It definitely emerger would be the way to translate it. So, giving that introduction, it's already taken longer than I expected, so I should get on now with these slides. So here we can then take that and then understand that, you see, each of the four truths is understood in four aspects. Usually the name of the first aspect is given as the name of the truth itself. But for the first two, so we say, for example, the truth of the cessation and the path. You might remember the first aspect of cessation was cessation. The first aspect of path was path. The first aspect of suffering was impermanence. The first aspect of origin was cause. So we see the names impermanent and cause are not coextensive with the truth itself. So if we called it the truth of impermanence, it would be confusing, because actually something that's impermanent is not necessarily the first noble truth. For example, a Buddha, right? At least a Buddha's mind. We could say the Buddha, in it as a principle, the nature body is permanent, but the omniscient consciousness is impermanent. It's not the truth of suffering. So we take the second aspect name. So it's impermanent and suffering and so forth. So we take the second one. And likewise with origin, we use the second name, the second aspect, origin, and not cause, because if we just called it cause, a lot of things are causes. They're not necessarily the second noble truth. But in any case, realizing any of the four noble truths requires realizing all four aspects that characterize it. So it's a four-part realization. So first, someone realizes four aspects individually. So with the first noble truth, first one realizes that the aggregates are impermanent. Then they realize that the aggregates are in the nature of suffering. Then they realize that the aggregates are empty. And they realize that the aggregates are selfless. But then through prolonged meditation, either a single mind realizes all four, or four minds conjoin to realize the truth. That's a point of debate. So what that means is that when we say realizing the truth of suffering, and the definition of the truth of suffering is that which, for one, is a truth in the side of the afflicted class. I think we talked about that last time. And then two, is characterized by impermanence, suffering, emptiness, and selflessness. So does one mind realize that? Does one mind realize that the aggregates are those four things? Or do you have four different minds, each individually realizing one that the aggregates are impermanent, one the aggregates are suffering, one the aggregates are empty, and so forth, and that those four are conjoined, are consciously manifest at the same time? This is a point of debate, and it's not exactly clear either way. Now, some people say, as Dharma Kirti says, that you cannot have two minds engaging at once. But some, at least in our Sarah J interpretation of that, Jason Juki Gelson interprets it that you cannot have two similar minds of a similar class. I think we talked about that last time too. But you could have one mind that realizes suffering is impermanent, one mind realizing it's selfless, because those actually support each other. They don't contradict each other. And if they're cultivated over a long time, they can gradually be manifest at the same time. We can have them in our conscious experience and have all four of those to bear as we meditate on suffering. Or it's that one mind realizes four things, which also is possible. It's entirely possible, even in the wrong consciousness. It's accepted that a person can think suffering is permanent and impermanent. Doesn't make any sense that it's both, but a mind could engage that way. What a mind cannot do is have two different observed objects. So a mind cannot think suffering is impermanent and dogs are cute. Right? The two different bases that then they are observing their individual aspects. But here we have one base, one observed object, which is suffering, and then thinking that it's four different things. That seems to, it's anyways understood to be possible. Anyway, the example that's given by Dharma Kirti there is you can't think that there's tigers in the south and ox in the north, right? You can't have, it's just two unrelated bases. I should also mention, because I realize I'm not sure I maybe mentioned it last time, but I will mention it again. When I say suffering, right, in terms of the truth of suffering, the second aspect, Dugniel Wa in Tibetan, it's not Dugniel, which would just be suffering. Suffering is a feeling. It's a mental factor, right? But Dugniel Wa is something quite different. It's the nature of suffering, something that is under the power of karma and afflictions. So it's important to distinguish that. Tenzin Gyaltsen himself makes that point, that we don't want to misunderstand. Not everything that's in the nature of suffering is suffering. For example, happiness. Our ordinary experience of happiness is the nature of suffering, but it is certainly not suffering. It's the opposite. Experience is the pleasure. It's a mental factor, but it's the suffering of change, and so it's the nature of suffering. Okay, so then there are also 16 wrong engagers presented that obstruct realizing these 16 aspects. Most of these wrong engagers are philosophically acquired views. Right, so that's an important point also. Thinking that there's no liberation, thinking that that the realization of selflessness is not the path to liberation. Right? Somebody doesn't think that if they're not trained in philosophy. It's not something that an animal is spontaneously going to have such an idea. So they're mainly philosophically acquired on views. But in the case of the four related to suffering, they can also be innate. That's the only exception. So the thing that the aggregates are clean, are happiness, are permanent, and are self, those all have innate conceptions as well that are held by those even who aren't trained in philosophy or even in language. So in the case of the first truth, the four rung engagers can be seen as the opposite of the four aspects with a little adjustment, which we'll discuss. But for the latter three truths, this is not necessarily the case. So I tried to explain how it could be, but it's understood anyway in the traditional text that it's not necessarily the case. It's not that there's a one-to-one correspondence with the aspect and the wrong engager that it counters. But understanding them will help us to overcome the wrong engagers. And then there may also be an order of realization within a group of four aspects. So last time we talked about there's a real order of realization. First you realize suffering, then you realize origin, then you realize cessation, then you realize path, although I said it's a little more complicated than that. But also within suffering, first you realize impermanence, then you realize nature of suffering, then you realize emptiness, then you realize selflessness. That seems to be pretty much accepted. That's Dharmakirti explicitly says that. We'll see in the next slide. But with the latter three, it's not necessarily the case, but it might be. It's a very vague point, and so people debate it either way. So four aspects of suffering. We'll start with these. This is from Dharmakirti in the second chapter of Commentary on Valid Cognition. By seeing emptiness, you're freed. The other meditations are supports. So from impermanent suffering, then selflessness. So see, there's an order that's presented here. But first of all, what does this first part mean? By seeing emptiness, you're freed. Emptiness in this context is understood as the selflessness of the emptiness of a self-sufficient person in the sense of being, or say a substantial person in the sense of being self-sufficient. It's not the emptiness of the Madhyamaka. So this is a point of debate also. Shanta Rakshita, the Madhyamaka scholar, and his followers, they actually understood this passage to be talking about emptiness of true existence. And they understood this to be a Madhyamaka text. This was negated by other Madhyamakas. They said that by emptiness, he just means emptiness of a substantial person. But in any case, of those 16 aspects, the main one is this is emptiness. It's not the third one, emptiness, it's the fourth one, selflessness. That is the actual thing that by meditating on it, one is free of samsara. The other meditations, the other 15, are all supports for that. They help us to realize that. So from impermanent suffering. So first, one realizes it at least within the first truth. First one realizes impermanence. Then suffering, the second aspect. And then from suffering, then selflessness, which includes both emptiness and selflessness. So from seeing the aggregates as impermanent, one comes to see that they are not reliable and change moment to moment under the force of karma and afflictions. So this is the first step. Because understanding nature of suffering means understanding under the force of karma and afflictions. That can only be understood when we understood that they change moment to moment. because we have to understand that that moment-to-moment change is impelled by karma, is impelled by affliction. If we don't have that, if we hold the aggregates as something solid, then it's impossible to see how it's being affected by karma. This is very clearly described by Kedrip in his text, Vediniki Munsa, the Dispelling the Darkness regarding the valid cognition. So this is Geshe Namdak in his book, with Geshe Lekso, the book that we have, what is it? Freedom Through Correct Knowing, I think. That has a good summary of this section. And then I think the full translation of this will be available before too long from Thupten Jinpa. I believe it's being published. So that section is in the section on Naljung Unsum on yogic valid perception, right? Then it goes into a whole excursus in the Four Noble Truths and the selflessness. So then anyway, then from that, then one can see that they are suffering because of the force of karma and afflictions. To see even higher concentrations as suffering, so not just our ordinary experience of the desire realm, but the form and formless absorptions, requires seeing their moment-to-moment change, hence subtle impermanence, right? To see that they gradually are deteriorating. They don't last forever. They're not truly liberation. And then by seeing that a person is under the power of karma and afflictions, one comes to see that there is no independent, self-sufficient person. So this is the stepping stone to realizing selflessness. Dharmakirti talks a lot about that, and also in what is Gompa Rebso is what is illuminating the intent by Tzong Khapa, according to the Madhyamaka school. He understands it that by simply realizing that a person is impermanent, one realizes coarse selflessness, because that is the understanding. Coarse selflessness is that the person is empty of being permanent, singular, and independent. So by understanding emptiness, impermanence, you already can negate that. There's no such thing as a permanent fixed person. So this leads gradually to the more subtle selflessness here, which is in this case the at least well, I'm talking about Dharmakirti. I was up until now. So in his case, it's the self-sufficient person. But then this last point here is the Versangika presentation. All four of these have both coarse and subtle aspects, except possibly impermanent. So this is what I said before. This leads into the Madhyamaka understanding. This comes from Shantideva, the 9th chapter of his text on wisdom. There, he has a very similar passage to this one we're just looking at from Dharmakirti. I don't know if it's intentionally similar, if he's trying to make a point by writing a similar passage, because he presents a wrong view, a kachik, we'd say in Tibetan. Like somebody says, "Dempa tongwe drugirgi toni tongwe chishik cha," right? So by seeing the truth, you're freed. So why do you need to meditate on emptiness? What's the purpose? Toni tongwe chishik cha. What does it do for you? Right? Why not just meditate on course selflessness, on what Dharmakirti considers subtle selflessness? And then Shantideva responds, "Gangche lunglen lam dini mepar duno mepar janta mepar zung." So because it said, and he's talking about in the Praniparamita Sutra, it said that without this path there is no enlightenment. Right? You're not liberated by seeing the truth in your understanding. You have only a coarse understanding of the noble truths. So what does it mean as subtle aspects? So, for example, we have the truth of suffering under the and the second aspect, under the power of karma and afflictions, is understand that the person is impelled, or the aggregates are impelled by past karma and afflictions. If we understand that in terms of afflictions being rooted in the self-sufficient person, the view of a self-sufficient person, that is a coarse understanding of the nature of suffering. Understanding that the aggregates are impelled by karma and afflictions rooted in the view of an inherently existent person, that is the subtle aspect of suffering. And so Dharmakirti, Chandakirti, he says actually to Bhava Viveka, what is it? Hyugi Naljo Dame Tomwahi, Sukla Mikne, Jukjir, Vedaki. Yeah, I don't have it coming to my mind right now. It's been a while since I've recited this, but basically his point is your yogic mind perceiving selflessness does not access the truth of the true nature of forms. So therefore, when you observe forms, you're naturally going to give rise to craving. Even if you meditate on the coarser forms of selflessness, you don't actually get to the very subtle view, the view of a real world that has inherently existent objects that is fueling the craving. So you cannot turn it back. And the example that's given is like somebody in a dream, or actually it's Yume Pume, so an illusory woman. So that you're viewing an illusion, a woman who's just an illusion. A man is viewing a woman who's just an illusion and finds her very beautiful and is attracted to her. So to overcome that, actually it says it's a monk in this case. So the monk wants to overcome his attachment, so he meditates on how this beautiful woman is impermanent and how she's selfless. And it gives some relief, but still there's some attachment that's just subtly there until he realizes it's just an illusion. Then there's no more attachment because it's just an illusion. There's nothing to gain from being attached to it. But and that's the example. So it's likewise here. If we just meditate on these coarser things, they can alleviate some degree of suffering. But we might even think we're liberated from samsara by meditating on it for a long time. But the very subtle conception is still there, and it will gradually manifest again. Now, Shantideva, he then presents a debate. Somebody says, well, even the illusion, the person who makes the illusion is still attracted to it, right? A magician makes an appearance of a beautiful woman, he might still find this attractive. So therefore, you're merely realizing that she's an illusion doesn't help. But Shantideva says, if you think that, it's because your meditation on emptiness is weak. Just knowing it intellectually is not enough. You have to meditate on it for a long time. So I won't get into all 16 of these. You'll get into that in Madhyamaka, in the first chapter, actually, of Illuminating the Intent. He quotes this from Shantideva. But the point is, except possibly impermanence. That's the Ditsen Shugyi Gelson's view, contrary to some of the other views of the other monasteries. That is subtle. Within the 16 aspects, the course 16 aspects is still subtle impermanence. There's nothing more subtle than that. That's within the subtle aspects, but the other 15 all have correspondingly subtler aspects once one understands emptiness. Okay, so the 4 aspects versus the 4 wrong engagers. So we talked a little bit about that before, but here to specifically, how do they counter these 16? We're just going to take the example mainly of the first 4 because that's really the most important one. So again, from Dharmakirti, on these 4 truths, stability, then happiness, then me and mine. Imputing these and 16 wrong engagers, craving multiplies. So what is he saying here? Stability, right? And then we have say permanence. And then happiness, and then me and mine, that's quite different than what we said before. We said clean and self. So it's me anyway is similar, but the mine is different. So Dharmakirti presents permanence, happiness, mine and me as the opposite of impermanence, suffering, emptiness, and selflessness. He gives a one-to-one correspondence. And the mixed order of me and mine in the verse, right? See, it's not mine and me, it's me and mine, is due to prosodic concerns. So I don't know, in Sanskrit, it must be that way. That's what I was told by when we were answering this at Tehura Kongsen is the largest house group for Kongsen in our monastery, and my partner and I from my class, we had to answer about the 4 Noble Truths with these 1,000 people from Tehura Kongsen all debating us, and then they asked us, why does he say me first and mine second? So we made up some answer, but then the Kongsen, the director of the Kongsen, who's also one of the senior teachers there, he interrupted and he explained it to us. So the point is that in Sanskrit, apparently me and mine aren't both monosyllabic as they are in both Tibetan and English. So in Tibetan, deda ngara ngai shesok, deda ngara ngai shesok, right? It says, so nga and nge, it's the same thing. It's both one syllable, so you could easily reverse them. We could just say here, then happiness, then mine and me. But apparently in Sanskrit, it wasn't so easy, so he mixed the order up. But it really should be mine first. There's no particular reason that me is plinth first. And then his ascertaining valid cognition, another text by Dharmakirti, considers clean to indicate a substantially different person, right? So mine is the opposite of clean. Emptiness is the opposite of clean, which is related to mine. So what is that talking about? That clean, not in the sense that the aggregates, like my current body is clean, but that there is a permanent unchanging self that's clean, that's not polluted by the pollution of the aggregates. That's separate. That's the real me. And the aggregates are simply mine. They are not who I really am. What I really am is we say Atman, the truly existent separate self that's clean in and of itself. So that's how he understands this distinction. And so that is countered by emptiness, which is the view, which is understanding that there is not a real person who is substantially different from the aggregates. That's emptiness in this context. It's not anything to do with emptiness like we talk about in Madhyamaka. It's just emptiness of a substantially separate person. So hence, emptiness negates mine. The aggregates are not possessed by a permanent self that is substantially different from them, because the self is understood not to be permanent. So at the beginning of chapter 2, then not the beginning, but the beginning of the part on the Four Noble Truths, then Dharmakirti talks about this quite a bit, and it talks about how we understand emptiness by understanding that there's not a jingi lopapo, he says, a blesser. Really, it means like a puppeteer is the idea, not somebody different. And then in a Sangha's presentation, which is different, which is what we actually usually follow, this is in the Kundu, the Abhidhamma Samuccaya. Clean replaces mine, right? As suffering is the opposite of both happiness. So then here the order and the pairing is different. And so we have the view, clean, permanent, clean, happy, self, permanent, and self, right? So clean in this case, you're just talking about relieving that the aggregates are clean. My current body is clean. A person that I'm attracted to, their body seems clean to me. It doesn't look disgusting. Whereas, we use the meditation on foulness of the body to counter that, to say that a person's body is actually made of all kinds of elements that are in and of themselves would be repulsive to us, but it seems just clean and attractive to us because of our misconception. And then happiness is the view that things external to us, or things that we are object of our attachment, so not necessarily external, it could also be meditative bliss and so forth, that these things bring happiness. So suffering is the opposite of both happiness and clean. That the aggregates are, in terms of their cause, they arise from impure causes, which is essentially afflictions. They're not something that's just magical and what do we say? We're very attracted to a person. We almost see them as sublime. Some people even make up all kinds of philosophies about how the person they're attracted to is heavenly and divinely inspired or whatever. But here it's that they are arising from impure causes. And then in terms of the result, that they are happiness, they're not going to give rise to happiness. They're actually going to give rise to suffering in the long run. So suffering is the opposite of both of those. And then, of course, impermanence counts as permanent. That's one-to-one correlation. But then emptiness and selfless are two sides of the opposite of self. So we have the view of the self, and they counteract acquired wrong views. Not the subtle wrong, the innate wrong view is different, but acquired wrong view that the substantial self is substantially different from the aggregates or one with the aggregates. So that's emptiness and then selflessness. So the latter can also counteract an innate view. But generally it's presented, we'll see this like in Gyaltsab Je, and then in again in Galwa-Gindenjuk, the first Dalai Lama, in their commentaries on this text by Dharmakirti, which they're also in that context talking also about Asanga's understanding that the latter two views they counteract the acquired wrong view, and those become the sign, right? So if we have a sign, a correct sign to prove selflessness, it would say the subject, the self of persons, it does not exist. Well, actually, it's Rangjigi Meide, which we could translate in English as it does not exist naturally or innately. It's not the prasangic understanding, but it's not. Is Rangjigi Mei, it does not exist natural. It's not an inherently existent thing, because it is not neither inherently one or different from the aggregates. So substantial, maybe we'd say, how do kids say is Rangjin in English? I don't want to say inherent because I don't want you to confuse it with prasangika. Well, we could say it is not substantially one. It's not substantially existent because it is not substantially one or different from the aggregates. So the establishing the sign, it's not substantially one or different from the aggregates. That is these latter two aspects of the Four Noble Truths, of the truth of suffering. Then establishing the thing to be proven, right, that it is not substantially existent. That is not one of these four aspects that is proven by those. So those counteract they lead us to that realization. Okay, so then who holds these views? There's actually not one clear presentation or agreement on that. So I've actually put this together based on a number of different presentations I've seen. One of the best ones is in there's a commentary on Hari Bhadra's text. What is it? Dravidumsal is in English. The Clear Meaning commentary. Commentary on that by Gungtang Lodra Gyatso from the 19th century. So he has this list of who holds these views, and also some of the teachers like Geshe Jambel Loshe was a teacher at Sarah, and so he was giving teachings on this, and he explained it this way. So the first one, views 1 to 3, that the aggregates are clean, happiness, and permanent. Most sentient beings. So there's just innate views that sentient beings hold. The fourth one, that they are self. A lot of the Vedic schools, so Nyaya, Samkhya, and other Vedic schools, a lot of the Indian schools believe in an Atman. And then secondly, the view of the origin, so viewing there is no cause of suffering. Logician Lokayatans. So the Lokayatans are the ones, they say Gyang Pempa in Tibetan, which literally means thrown afar. They've thrown afar any semblance of a philosophy of things that is coherent. They don't believe in karma and rebirth is the main point. So there was a view of that in ancient India. Nowadays, it's a lot more prevalent, but there were people who believed in that. So that's what I was talking about before. So do they not believe in cause and effect at all? Well, again, they might believe that, again, if I hit myself with a hammer, that it hurts. They would have pretty strange view not to have just a simple thing like that. But the point is that there is no greater cause. There's nothing beyond this life. So Lalishan Lokayatans, because it's also understood that there is what's called the concentration Lokayatans, the ones who engage in meditation, who actually do recollect some of their past lives, and so they believe in past lives, but they only believe that there's 1 or 2 or even 100, but not more than that. So the logician ones don't believe in any past lives at all. And then we have Vaiseshikas. So this was a later development of the Nyaya school. They believe in a partless cause. So there's one cause that causes suffering. And then Shaivites, worshippers of Shiva, of course, or of Ishvara, believing that that Ishvara is the master behind the experience of karma. And then the Samkhyas believing in something that is permanent and changes occasionally or temporarily, as I mentioned before. So then the third one, that there is no liberation, again, logician Lokayatans. And then that certain states of concentration are liberation, or states that are contaminated, Mimamsas and Shaivites. So Mimamsa is a very strong Vedic school. Actually, it's one of the strongest logician schools in ancient India, and still, I think they have existing functioning today. They're trying to prove the validity of the Vedas, but they believe that there was no liberation, as I talked about before. But you can achieve a kind of concentration for a period of time that will be, like liberation. At least you're not suffering actively during that time. And then the view that there is a liberation that is not, that it can deteriorate. That's Mimamsas and Jains, as I talked about before. And then the view that there's no path, again, the logician Lokayatans, and then the view that the path of selflessness is not the correct path, the view that there is a real self, that the view of selflessness is wrong, Samkhyas and Nyayas, and then Samkhyas believing that there is that certain states of concentration. Again, I sometimes feel self-conscious about presenting their views based upon my study of it through the eyes of the Buddhist scholars. I have read a few books trying to present them. It's hard to find really clear ones, actually, at least in English. Maybe if someone reads in Hindi or Sanskrit, they could find better ones. But anyway, the presentation that's in Gyaltsabje's commentary on Dharmakirti of the Samkhya view of liberation is that one concentrates and gradually distinguishes that the person, which is the same as the consciousness in this case in their system, Puruja, is separate from the aspects, the prakriti. They can be the nature that appears as all of these varied things. They can be separated, and you don't have to be entangled with it or involved with it. And thereby, one does not have to cycle through samsara. It's all just an illusion appearing before you. So you can start to see that it's all just the manifestation of this prakriti. Anyway, the way it's presented there is that if you concentrate on it long enough, the prakriti will withdraw itself. And then it says that by like walking in on a woman in the bath, and she's embarrassed and she flees. So you see the woman who's behind all of it, and then but you see her nakedly, and she's embarrassed and she just withdraws. So that's what happens when you see the nature of prakriti. It no longer plays out this illusion for you, and you recognize the pure consciousness that you then abide in. And then fourthly, Mimamsas and Jains believe that there is, again, there's a path, but it does not lead to a permanent state of liberation. Okay, so then, do the wrong views necessarily apprehend that truth? Right. So, for example, if I have the wrong view of permanence, it's thinking that the aggregates, the appropriating aggregates, are permanent. Is that necessarily apprehending the truth of suffering? So apprehending suffering as having no cause does not apprehend the origin, right? If I think there is suffering and it has no cause, it's not observing the origin of suffering and thinking it doesn't exist. It's a little different the way it engages its object, right? So it's not directly a wrong engager into the origin, right? Literally, a wrong engager should be something that observes the origin and then apprehends it in a wrong way. That's what wrong engagement means. But it functions as a wrong view, preventing the realization of origin. That's why it's considered to function as a wrong engager, because it obstructs seeing the way the origin actually is. And then apprehending some contaminated states as liberation does not apprehend cessation. It's not that you view cessation and think that's not cessation or that's not liberation. You view something else and think it is liberation. But again, it functions as a wrong view, preventing the realization of cessation. Wrong engagers can also function indirectly, right? So this is the case within the first truth, especially. So for example, desire, pride, and holding one's own view as supreme can observe a wrong view and support it. So with desire, I like my view, right? So first you have the view of a real person. We say that jikta, what is it? The changing aggregates. I forget the word in English, how we say it. the aggregate, the perishing aggregates, and then viewing that it's a real person, right? And then I like my view. I think my view is correct. I have the best view. So that's observing one's view and thinking it's as supreme. And then others' views are inferior and threatening. So that can be a kind of, actually anger itself can engage that way. So anger in relation to views. So in that sense, it's not directly that anger itself is observing suffering and thinking it's bad or whatever. It's just that anger, the more we reinforce our view with these other secondary afflictions, then the harder it is to overcome it, because it's not just about an intellectual understanding. It's very much rooted in our experience of who we are and what we want and don't want. So we have this quote by Chandrakirti that I like very much, just talking about the purpose of all of these meditations is to overcome our suffering, and that if we are too attached to our own views, this gets in the way of overcoming them. So we have to be willing to let go of them. So this is here he's talking about Nagarjuna and in the root wisdom, right? So that he's doing Nagarjuna does all these debates that are attacking others' views. So somebody might think that it's just because he likes to debate with people. But Chandrakirti says, the text analyses he didn't make for penchant for debate, but freedom's sake. If when explaining thusness is ensues that other system fail, no fault accrues. And so if I talk about emptiness and it destroys other people's philosophy, that's not a bad thing. It's not done out of anger or despite. It's done to try to free them from their wrong views. So wrong notions are attachment to one's views and animosity towards others' views. So lay aside your anger and your greed, examine well, and quickly you'll be freed. So next we have our true cessation's emptiness. So now this is a different subject. I said we have a number of secondary subjects here that are still major points of debate, but don't quite form the major overarching structure of the debates on the Four Noble Truths, which are the first two that I mentioned, the order and the 16 aspects. So first of all, a true cessation's emptiness. Now, to give the very short answer, in the Prasangika system, yes. In the Chittamatra, mind-only system, yes. At least according to Sarah J. There is some debate about that. However, in their system, the emptiness of a substantially existent person is also emptiness. So it can be either that, or it can be the emptiness of duality. In the Prasangika, it's only the emptiness of inherent existence. In the Sabbadharmika system, it is not. Truth cessations are not emptiness. But then the question is why not? And how do we make sense of what some of the different scholars say about these things? So, but the Svadhantrika, sorry, I misspelled that. Svadhantrika, not Tatrika. Svadhantrika, they are not. Cessations are not emptiness, because Hinayana arhats do not need to realize emptiness, right? Bhavaviveka makes this argument very strongly probably in Doke Baro, but also probably Shera Drome, his commentary on, I'm trying to remember which one it's in, but he has two commentaries, right? It's not that important now. But one is the Blaze of Reasoning, which is his commentary on his own text, the Heart of the Madhyamaka, and then his text, Lamp of Wisdom, which is a direct commentary on Nagarjuna's text. In any case, he argues very strongly that Hinayanas do not have to realize emptiness, Hinayana arhats. So it would absurdly follow, right, that if they don't realize emptiness, but they attain cessation, it would absurdly follow that they do not realize the truth of cessation, because cessation is emptiness, or even a cessation in their own continuum. They attain cessation without even realizing it, because they can't perceive emptiness. Furthermore, it would follow that Arya Bodhisattvas do not directly realize the nature body of natural purity, right? Because the nature body of natural purity, which is emptiness, if it was also cessation, then to directly realize it, it says, because the nature body would be a true cessation, to directly realize a true cessation, it is necessary to attain it. It seems that all the schools agree on that. I haven't seen an explicit comment by either of the scholars, by either Bhavaviveka or Chandrakirti, saying if you directly realize true cessation, you have to attain one. You have to directly realize you have to attain it. But it seems to be understood in any way. And our Sarah J. Yikcha, the text by Jetsun Chökyi Gyaltsen, he's explicit about that. In the Tachu, what do you say in English? The examining extremes with regard to the first chapter in Parchin, Paramita, then he says very explicitly what I just said. And also in his commentary on Uma, on the Madhyamaka, which is the Prasangic system, he says quite clearly that if you realize a true cessation, you have to directly realize that you have to attain it. So how does that work for Prasangika? Because, and the nature body is emptiness, it is also cessation. It seems that the understanding, this is the more subtle thing that is a major point of debate there, is that you can realize the emptiness aspect without realizing the aspect of being cessation. It is cessation, but you can directly realize the emptiness without realizing the cessation aspect of it, and thereby you don't have to attain it. If you realize the aspect of it being cessation, it's one object or one negation with two objects of negation. It's one object negation with, it negates both true existence and how do you say, both true existence and the afflictions, right? The abandonment of the afflictions. So we had somebody come to our Kongzhen. So you see, now I'm on the attacking side. Many years ago, when we were younger, we went around to the different Kongzhens to answer debate, as I talked about going to this one about the Four Noble Truths. But now, you know, we're the more senior people. So when the people come to our Kongzhen, we heckle them about these points. So when some of the younger kids, they came to our Kongzhen and they were asking about, we were debating, I don't think it was about the Four Noble Truths, but it came up anyway. It was about Uma, actually. It was about Madhyamaka. And the question was, why for the Svatandrika, you know, why is the nature body not the truth of cessation? And his answer was that in the Svatandrika system, one negation cannot have two objects of negation, right? Well, is that the case? Is that the reason that Chandrakirti disagrees with Bhaviveka? So I asked him, well, does that mean that not being emptiness is not the object of negation of emptiness, right? And what does that mean? Well, so it's also the word emptiness negates not being emptiness. We would generally accepted if we'd studied the system on how something negates something, right? Negations, that any word negates its opposite. So saying pot, it negates non-pot. So emptiness negates non-emptiness. It doesn't just negate true existence. And non-emptiness is an existent thing, because a pot is not emptiness. So one negation negates both the existent and the non-existent. And it would be very hard to say that in Bhaviveka's system that he doesn't accept that. But anyway, he ignored my question. But then one of the other monks later brought it up again, and then tried to push it. But again, he kind of evaded answering it, which is the general strategy if someone doesn't have a good answer, especially when you're sitting in front of a few hundred people. It's not easy. But actually, I hadn't even thought of that before, and I still don't have a great answer to that. So what would Bhaviveka say in his system? Why can't true cessation also be emptiness and have two objects of negation? So anyway, this is a very major point of debate, although maybe it's a minor point in terms of our own understanding. But some of you might have studied the Golden Garland by Tsongkhapa. And there's a lot of things that the Tsongkhapa says in the Golden Garland that are really hard to understand and don't seem to fit with the overall philosophy. Maybe it's because he wrote it when he was young, but he was only 31 when he completed it. It was his first major work. So anyway, in that text, on his section on the Four Noble Truths, it says, when Golden Garland says that the freedom from afflictions and emptiness that is free of them, sorry, I'm bad grammar here, that the freedom from afflictions, that's one thing, and that the emptiness is free of them, right? So the arhats, in the arhats continuum, the emptiness of the mind, which is free of affliction, because it's just by nature, the person has no affliction, their emptiness has no affliction. He says they are both true cessations. He says that both of them are cessation, and emptiness is cessation is not necessarily emptiness, is not necessarily not emptiness. Both of them are. For one thing, it is presenting the system of Abhidhamma Samuccaya, a Chittamatra text. That's actually very explicit there because he quotes that text. So for some reason, in the middle of a conversation or a presentation of this Vatantrika system, he gives a quotation from a Chittamatra text. So we don't have to take this as his view of this Vatantrika system. For some reason, he's presenting the Chittamatra system. Prasangikas also hold this view. But this is how one of my teachers explains it anyway, that it is not that these are two different things. He's not saying that emptiness, that's a cessation, which is just the mere emptiness, the absence of affliction, versus the emptiness of true existence, are two different things. But they can be viewed from two different angles. It's one thing that has two objects of negation. So the freedom is emptiness. The emptiness is freedom. One non-affirming negation has two objects of negation. I won't get into it more now, but this is one of the hardest debates within the Four Noble Truths, and that's obviously why we were doing that there. It's probably the most commonly done thing to when somebody comes to answer in front of your Kangzin, because you want to give them the hardest debate, right? So then also there's a question in chapter 4 of the Ornament for Clear Realization, and what's it, the third or fourth verse, he talks about cessation, and by way of the 16 emptinesses. So it would seem to say that he's saying the 16 emptinesses are cessation, and thereby saying that cessation is an emptiness. But our understanding anyway, because this is taken as a Vatantrika text. Of course, there's some debate about that. Some people take it as a Madhyamaka, as a Prasangika text. But if we want to take it as a Vatantrika text, it says it is describing the object of meditation for attaining cessation. So cessation is the benefit, right? Is payun in Tibetan, which is like a privilege or a benefit. It means that when he says the 16 aspects of suffering, 16 kinds of emptinesses, he's saying these are what you meditate on. The benefit of doing so is that you'll attain cessation. That's how it's related. It's not that actually the emptiness is cessation. So then further questions about cessations. What is the basis of negation when the aggregates are gone? The absence of the aggregates? Right, so if we talk about a remainderless nirvana, right, then there's just the abandonment of the aggregates, of the aggregates and of the suffering aggregates. What's the basis for that? Where is it? There has to be some basis for any negation, right? So, for example, when we have nirvana with remainder, then the lack of afflictions in that person's mind, that person still exists. What is the basis of negation here? This is a question especially that becomes difficult in relation to the mind-only system, because when you have an emptiness, it has to be related to a zhenwang, meaning an other-powered phenomenon, right? But if that's the case, then we would say, for example, though, that maybe it's related to the valid cognizer realizing it, and therefore they're one nature. But that would imply that thereby, in ordinary beings have attained remainderless nirvana, because it's one nature with their valid cognizer realizing it. So there's a lot of debate about that. And then, are there three bases of negation for the three objects abandoned? Right. So you abandon, at least in this Vatantrika system, the conception of a substantial self, the conception of duality, and the conception of true existence. So when you abandon the conception of a substantial self and become a Hinayana Arhat, is that emptiness, is that cessation thereby a emptiness of the self? And then when you abandon the conception of duality, is that emptiness non-duality? When you abandon the conception of true existence, is that cessation emptiness of true existence? But there's a lot of problems with that. For example, in the first case, if you're first a Hinayana Arhat, and then later you achieve Mahayana path and become a Buddha, your earlier abandonment of the substantial view of a substantial self Does it later merge with your abandonment of the conception of true existence, or do they maintain a distinct identity? But in that case, there would be two different kinds of Buddhas. The Buddhas who were previously Hinayana Arhats would have 2 or 3 separate cessations in their continuum, whereas a Buddha who abandons them all at once by just following the Mahayana path would have one cessation that is an abandonment of all of them. So how exactly does that work? And then what is the pacification that is pacified pervasive compositional suffering? So if you studied in the first chapter, this section, we say the reality limit that is indicated in this context, you might know what I'm talking about. It's a major point of debate in the first chapter. It's based on a passage within the Prajnaparamita Sutra. These are the 3 major questions that come up about what are they talking about? The pacification that is pacified pervasive compositional suffering. What is that? Is it a cessation? Is it nirvana? Is it a subtle selflessness of person? So I would say perhaps it is nirvana, which means it's also a cessation, but it's not a subtle selflessness. If anybody's interested in that point, if you study that, and if you can read Tibetan, then please let me know. Actually, the first time I wrote an essay in Tibetan about the traditional text, I wrote it on this subject, so I could send that if anybody wants to see it. It's about 10 or 15 pages about this particular question, which is a very difficult question within the first chapter. So then a related question, because of the abandonment of pervasive conventional suffering, we have to understand what that is, right? The third kind of suffering, we say kappa dujigi dungyo, right? So within the first noble truth is the pervasive compositional suffering, which is coextensive with truth of suffering. They're the same thing, really, understood from 2 different angles. But is it an obscuration? Can we say it's an obscuration in the way that afflictions and the cognitive obscurations are obscurations? If not, then how is its abandonment a true cessation? Right? Shouldn't true cessation be the abandonment of an obscuration, as opposed to just like you're a body? When you die, you don't have a cessation of the body. That's not considered a true cessation. It cannot be an obscuration, the pervasive conventional suffering. This is why not? We can prove that by saying, if it was an obscuration, it would have to be either an afflictive or knowledge obscuration. That is stated very clearly in our textbook, Tenzin Gache, and with a reference to the text Uta, differentiating middle from extremes by Maitreya, which is considered very authoritative in terms of understanding of this school. So they understand that there's only 2 kinds of obscurations, afflictive and knowledge obscurations. But it cannot be an afflictive obscuration because it is still there at nirvana with the remainder. One attains the pacification that is pacified pervasive conventional suffering when one attains remainderless nirvana. A arhat who has a remainder of the aggregates, of the contaminated aggregates, has not abandoned that, but they have abandoned afflictive obscuration. So it cannot be an afflictive obscuration. It also cannot be a knowledge obscuration, or it would disappear at remainderless nirvana, or would not disappear. Right? So when the arhat, Hinayana arhat, attains remainderless nirvana, they do attain the pacification and pervasive compositional suffering. But they cannot abandon even a slight piece of the knowledge obscurations, so there's no way they could obtain that. So they cannot be either of those. So the abandonment of afflictions that is also abandoned compositional suffering is a true cessation with 2 objects of abandonment. That's what we have to understand. The pacification that is pacified pervasive compositional suffering. It is a particular kind of cessation, one that has not only abandoned the afflictions, but has also abandoned the truth of suffering. And one attains that, at least on the Hinayana path, when attaining the remainderless nirvana. We'll get back actually on the next slide, I believe, about when is a bodhisattva attain that, which is a harder question. So another question is there a common base of true origins and form? Right. So in terms of the true suffering, absolutely. One mind body is a true suffering. Actually, not just my body, but the world we live in. So the madapa nugi jikten, the impure container world, is the truth of suffering. But what about true origins? So Hari Bhadra's clear meaning commentary, in the context of true origins, it says, form and so forth the causes. It certainly seems to say that he's saying all 5 of the aggregates can be the truth of the origin. And then Kedrip Tenpa Darge, who is the textbook writer for Sarah May, takes this literally. the fourth link of name and form as the beginning of life. So this is why I have the picture here of a zygote. This is the beginning of, this is what he's talking about. The first moment of conception is a true origin, because it is the basis for all future suffering in that lifetime. That's just the beginning of a lifetime that's going to be filled with suffering. But Jetsun Chökyi Gyaltsen, or Sarah J., he disagrees. True origins are necessarily not form. They can only be, well, at least they cannot be form. I was about to say it can only be minds, but that is a different question that we'll get to in a minute. So we can read Hare Bhadra when he says form and so forth, the causes, as meaning the causes of form and so forth. There's no genitive particle in the Tibetan, but we kind of read it in there. So then the next question, are true origins necessarily minds? Well, that's a separate question that we'll get to. But we'll get that next, I think. First here we have, is there a common base of a path and true origins? This is another major point of debate. This comes up in the Lamrim Chenmo and the Golden Garland, both by Tzong Khapa. So he says in the Golden Garland, suffering and paths are not mutually contradictory, like the truth of the afflicted class and the pure class. So that, just to mention, that's a side point, but our understanding of that is that, again, because Golden Garland is often quite opaque, is that it's not the truth of suffering, the truth of the path. Those are mutually contradictory. Suffering and path, suffering and true paths are not contradictory. Something can be a true path, but still be an suffering experience. For example, when a person on the Arya path regrets a past negative action, that is a virtuous mind. It is the truth of the path, but it is an experience of suffering. They think, I did that. I feel so bad about that. Maybe not something they did while they were an Arya, but something they did before that. But the true origins cannot be paths, he says, Tzong Khapa, because they must be afflictions or karma motivated by afflictions. It can only be one of those two things. Paths follow after a realization of selflessness and are an excellent method for attaining nirvana. They are not suitable to be a cause of future existence, which is what a truth of the origin would be, but rather work to sever it. When the Compendium of Ascertainments, another text by Asanga, says that the paths of accumulation and preparation are origins, this is why he's asking this question. It says that very clearly in the Asanga's text, because it means that they are simulacrums of the faulty behavior of body, speech, and mind that leads to further existence. In other words, they're contaminated. In that sense, they're similar to the truth of suffering. They are not uncontaminated paths like the Arya paths. They are similarly only in being contaminated and not in being origins. Then in Lamrim Chenmo, he says, practitioners on the paths of accumulation and preparation do, of course, unreflectively accumulate impelling karma. Right? It's not until one is on the Arya path that one is no longer accumulating on impelling karma. On the path of accumulation, it's understood somebody can even have anger such that it demolishes the roots of virtue and they can't advance on the path. That is clearly going to be further karma. But when motivated by the wish for liberation or meditating on selflessness, this becomes an antidote for further existence and engages in a contrary manner the apprehension of self, the root of samsara. Therefore, it is not an actual unreflective true origin. Right? So it's not when we're actually engaging in the path, practicing, then it does not become the cause of further samsara. It only becomes a cause for liberation, even though it's not an uncontaminated path. However, look at his wording. He said it is not an actual unreflective true origin. Does that mean it's not a true origin, or does it qualifying it? That's what the point of question here is. And there are two different schools of thought even within our monastery. Many of the teachers have different opinions, so I'll present those two here. So another perspective. This is one of my teachers at Lowa Kongsan, a student of Chödö Rinpoche. Maybe this was Chödö Rinpoche's view also. I expect it was, if he's presenting it this way. So he says, but don't practitioners on these first two paths of accumulation and preparation need to accumulate the causes for positive rebirths? Right? They need to be born as a human being or as a god to continue in their path. They don't just want to stop accumulating the cause for that for the time being in order to continue on the path. And furthermore, can't they practice the 10 virtues? right? They can practice abstaining from killing, abstaining from stealing, and so forth, with the immediate motivation for positive rebirth. Thinking, I want to take monastic vows so I can obtain a positive rebirth, so I can continue on the path to liberation, but with an underlying motivation of attaining liberation. Because the temporal result of pratimoksha vows is birth as a human or a god. That's very clearly presented in the pratimoksha vows themselves. That is an understandable temporal result as opposed to the ultimate result of liberation. Arvidhamma Samuchaya by Sangha says that for a bodhisattva on the first two paths, accumulation and preparation, their activities, for example, like abstaining from eating in the evening, reducing sleep, and studying, are paths. It's very explicit. You'll see that if you read the section on the path of preparation in the Jetsun Chökyi Gyaltsen's commentary. He quotes this. So in that case, how can there be virtuous impelling dharma apart from these paths? Right. So a bodhisattva who's on the first two paths, they're going to accumulate impelling karma. It's throwing karma. It's not necessarily non-virtuous. See, they also have virtuous impelling karma, which is still the truth of the origin. Nobody disputes that. So why would they have it apart from these paths? Why is it that sometimes their practice of not eating in the evening is a true path, is not a true path, but is a path of preparation, a path of accumulation, and sometimes it's not? What would be the difference? So therefore, because you could say, well, when they're doing it for liberation, it's a path. When they're doing it just for a good rebirth, it's not. But why would they have to be different? If they're really a good practitioner, they should always be thinking of liberation. But at the same time, they have to accumulate the causes for positive rebirth, otherwise they can't continue the path. So therefore, although the realization of selflessness is not a true origin, realization of selflessness, that's what Tsongkhapa says in Golden Garland, that is not a true origin, but the method side paths can be. They are not unreflective true origins, but intentional ones. So rangawa in Tibetan. Rangawa means just like doing as you please. But they're intentional. They're very focused kind of truth origin. They're intentionally wanting to be born in a particular way. So, but some people say the paths of accumulation and preparation cannot arise under the power of karma and afflictions. This is the opposite view. Otherwise, we would already have generated them, right? If they could have come from just karma and afflictions, which would have to be if they're true origins, then why didn't we gain them before? Why don't we've been suffering? We've been cycling since beginningless time. We must have done everything before. Well, some people might argue, well, we've already been on the path of accumulation, but we fell off the path. But that doesn't seem like a very satisfying answer. That everyone has done that sometime since beginningless time. Anyway, this is the point of view of a different teacher, actually the one I mentioned before, Geshe Jampa Logé, who passed away quite sadly some years ago, but he was one of the major scholars of this generation at Sarah. So then, another question, is there a common base of true paths and persons? Right, so not talking now about true paths and suffering, or truth of suffering, but true paths and persons. So this is Jetsun Chökyi Gyaltsen in Sarah J. He asked this question. Because remember, in the Vanadrika school, the mental consciousness is a person, is the illustration of a person. So he asks, is the mental consciousness that is an illustration of person in the continuum of a hearer certain to be born 7 more times? That's just an example of an Arya being, right? It's a Hinayana Arya being who is certain to be born 7 more times. Is their mental consciousness that is an illustration of a person? Is it a true path? Well, isn't it a hearer certain to be born 7 more times? It's an illustration of that person, so shouldn't it be that person? But an illustration of something should be that thing that it illustrates. And therefore, an Arya being. An Arya being must directly realize selflessness. So therefore, it's a mind realizing selflessness. So it should be a path. And if it's a path in the continuum of an Arya being, it should be an Arya path. There should be a true path. But isn't it also born under the power of karma and afflictions? Because that person is the hearer, certain to be born 7 more times. That's what it means, born 7 more times under the power of karma and afflictions. So then is not also a true suffering? We've already said that can't happen. You cannot have a true, a common locus of a true suffering and a true path. Maybe of a path, but not of a true path, an Arya path. So some people say it is a person born under the power of karma and afflictions, but it is not actually arisen from karma and afflictions. It's a bit of a word distinction. However, quite honestly, and I hate to say this myself because I have not taken this view, it does seem to be what Tenzin Gache finally settles on. But it's actually hard to say that's true for sure, because we have different editions of his textbook. So when I first was reading this textbook, when I studied this, what was it? Like 14 years ago now, I guess. It didn't say this. So that's what I got used to. But that was a old edition. And then Geshe Yamasonam, who was a teacher here at Sarah, he got together with a lot of the senior teachers and put together a standardized edition of the text of Tenzin Gache based upon all the different editions that were there. And they had to decide upon, when there was a difference in what it actually said in different editions, to which one they were going to follow. And this was going to then decide the future of Sarah J's stance on these things. So they had all the scholars have a big discussion about this, and this is one of the points. In this particular place, it's just a matter of where in the sentence do you put the word no pervasion. And in two different editions, it was placed in different parts of the sentence, meaning a different thing. So the current edition says very clearly, this person is arisen from karma and afflictions. Why? Because they are a person born under the power of karma and afflictions, no pervasion. So, okay, that does seem to be his stance. And anyway, another one of my teachers at Lowa Kangzin does not have that stance, and I agree with him. I agree with his reasoning behind it. But a few, also, I think last year at our Kangzin, another one of these younger people came. In this case, actually, the person who was answering was Dromul Rinpoche, who was the reincarnation of one of Lama Zopa Rinpoche's teachers. And so he took this third position, this one we have here, the third bullet point, which is what the Ikta currently says. And then, so I tried to debate him on that. And actually, I have to admit, he answered it very well. And I didn't look so good in that case. But it was a good lesson for me. I had to think more clearly about the opposite position. How would we try to negate this point? So anyway, here's what I would say the opposite is, this fourth bullet point. Some say that the illustration is not a hearer certain to be born 7 more times. So the illustration of a hearer, so the illustration, meaning the mental consciousness, it's an illustration, but it is not the thing that it illustrates. It is not a hearer certain to be born 7 more times. However, there is also some basis for that in Tenzin Gache's text. In the 8th chapter, he gives the example of the Sambhogakaya. And he says, and this is what I tried to debate with Dromul Rinpoche, but he had a good answer for it. But I'll say what this position would say is that he says that the Sambhogakaya, there's the illustration of that, which is the mental consciousness within the continuum of the Sambhogakaya, the Buddha. He says that is not the Sambhogakaya. It can't be. It's a mental consciousness. The Sambhogakaya is not a mental consciousness, right? If the mental consciousness was the Sambhogakaya, then it would have the marks and signs, which a Sambhogakaya has to have. It can't. It's a mind. So he says that there's a different. And this is actually a very important point for understanding the Savanadika system of selflessness. He says that the illustration of the Sambhogakaya is the Sambhogakaya's I. Nga into that. I, like not the I consciousness, but there's a letter I, me. Because that is what goes from life to life. All right, we think, if I remember a past life, I think this is me, this is I. I would not think this is Tenzin Gache. Even if I think about my childhood, it would be a bit odd when before I had the monastic name Tenzin Gache to think this is Tenzin Gache. But certainly, if I remembered a past life when I was a cow, it would be pretty strange to say this is Tenzin Gache. There's a common locus of Tenzin Gache and a cow. I wouldn't like that. So, but it is I. I is Tenzin Gache. That's correct. But to be I does not have to be Tenzin Gache. And then the mental consciousness is the illustration of the I. So in the case of the Sambhogakaya, the I is a Sambhogakaya. The mental consciousness is the I, but the mental consciousness is not Sambhogakaya. So it's the illustration in a indirect way. It illustrates the I illustrates the Sambhogakaya. So in this case, the mental consciousness illustrates the hearer's I. The I of the hearer illustrates the hearer. So because, and another reason is, this is what my teacher from the Hlobwa Kongzin, he comes up with this idea that because the mental consciousness that is the illustration of a person must be a generality that encompasses all mental consciousnesses in the continuum. Right? So when somebody has a mental consciousness that is an illustration of a person, it's not a particular mental consciousness. It's not the thought, that I'm going to do such and such thing. That's a mental consciousness, but that does not illustrate a person. One of my classmates actually has that opinion, and he knows that he's going against a lot of the textbooks, but he nevertheless feels that's really what Bhagavad meant. That every time one person has one continuous stream of consciousness, and whatever it's thinking is the illustration of the person at that time. He argues that quite well, but it doesn't seem, at least, to be the interpretation that's been taken by most recent scholars. So the point is that it's just the generality. The mental consciousness, the generality is the person, and all of the consciousness within the person are that generality, are instances of that, but none of them individually is a person. So it is never a path except in the case of a Buddha, because the person themselves has many mental consciousnesses, some of which are paths, some are not. So the generality cannot be a path. It's just mental consciousness, just the rongdok, we say in Tibetan, the self-isolate. It's not any particular mental consciousness. Except in the case of a Buddha, because all of their mental consciousnesses are Buddha, so the generality can also be. Okay, so then 2 more points. We're going to have time for question and answer too, but this shouldn't take too long. This comes back to what we talked about earlier. We were talking about the abandonment of the pervasive compositional suffering, or compounded suffering. And then Jetsun Chökyi Gyaltsen saying that an arhat still has truth of the origin. So we asked the question, is the true origin necessarily a mind? This is where this comes to play. So Jetsun Chökyi Gyaltsen says that an Hinayana arhat still has karmic true origins, but that they are neither impelling nor actualizing karma. So what are they? So he says there's 2 kinds of true origins: karmic true origins and afflictive true origins. But he says that the Hinayana arhat has something that is a karmic true origin, but it's neither impelling nor actualizing karma. So form cannot be a true origin. He's already established that. And an arhat cannot have karma motivated by afflictions. Right? So what is the karmic true origin? They cannot have karma motivated by afflictions because they don't have afflictions. So some people say that Jetsunpa's intention is that all minds that are true sufferings are also true origins. That is a pretty extreme position, but that is actually the most commonly accepted one here, because it seems to be the only way to make sense of his position. But this is problematic, to say that all minds that are also the truth of suffering are necessarily true origins. Because true origins are meant to be the causal aspect of the afflicted class. But things like I consciousness, that is a ripened result, are the resultant aspect. So if I consciousness is a true origin, why not the I itself? What makes the I consciousness true origin? An arhat has an I consciousness that is experiencing suffering. That's definitely true suffering. Why is it true origin? It's not going to give rise to any more suffering. It's just the exhaustion of their past karma. So if that's considered to be true origin, then why not the I itself, which Jetsun Chökyi Gyaltsen does not accept that the I is suffering, the true origin, because he accepts its form cannot be that. So personally, this is my position. I feel that the imprints of impelling karma is true origin. So I think that when he's saying karmic true origins, he's talking about the imprints, not the karma itself. But there's a lot of difficulty with this too. And again, like I said earlier about this point about the pervasive compositional suffering and the reality limit, that was the first essay I wrote in Tibetan. The second one was on this point. So if anybody would like to know, can read Tibetan and is interested, I can send that along as well. So this is Dharmakirti. Crossed over craving for this world, they can't impel a further birth. He's talking about remainder arhats who are to be born in a cyclic existence, but they do not have the craving that will ripen that karma. Now, what does that mean? Right? It says the same thing in the Lamrim Chemo, that arhats have countless past karma, right? It means they have countless past impelling karma, but they don't have the craving to ripen it. I think he even quotes this from Dharmakirti here. But we understand that, at least in our system, is because even an Arya being cannot have impelling karma, much less an Arhat. What he means is they have the imprints. They have many imprints, but they won't ripen. And the Abhidhammakosha also says that Arhats have indefinite karma. That's a very difficult concept. What does indefinite karma mean? But it says this also in Golden Garland. He quotes this in some of the commentaries on Abhidhammakosha. But this is important here in terms of this context. But indefinite karma, what does it mean? So we could say, well, indefinite karma is karma that's definitely going to bring its result. Indefinite karma is that which won't necessarily bring its result. What does that mean? From whose perspective? Things are only either going to happen or they're not going to happen in an ultimate sense, right? So we could say that a woman who's going to have a child is a definite woman, and a woman who's not going to have a child is an indefinite woman. Well, we don't know now, but if you might not know who's a definite and an indefinite in that case, but we say the God's eye perspective, it's either one or the other, right? So in that case, definite karma is that which definite to give a result. This means that which brings a result, whereas indefinite means that which doesn't bring a result. It's not that it might or might not. Or do you mean by definite karma that even if you purify it, it can't be purified? But is there such a thing? At least in the Mahayana understanding, there is not such a thing. This is again, so this was 2 years ago. I keep coming back to these debates at our Kangsen. The Rikchen, which is the person who's the top of the last class in the Larampa, right? He came to our Kangsen, and I asked him this very question. And fortunately, when the Rikchen comes to the Kangsen to answer the debate, then we don't have to do a lot of work because the senior teachers of our Kangsen also come. So all I had to do was ask this question, and then the senior teachers got up and debated the rest of it. But they really gave him a very hard time, and he basically fell apart there. So that's even the top scholars in the last year of the program. But when they have to answer these difficult questions, and especially with the senior teachers debating them, what does it mean, indefinite karma? I don't really know, but I tried to answer that, at least my understanding, is that it seems to be saying that karma, that it could still be there when you're an arhat. Whereas the definite karma seems that it has to be experienced somehow or another. So even though you might just have a headache, instead of experiencing birth in hell, that still, it has to bring some result. But indefinite karma is different. One can just detain it in arhatship, and then when they retain remainderless nirvana, it just dissolves. They never experience any result. But it could bring a result if the conditions are right. Anyway, the point is that they still have these imprints. And those imprints, maybe we could say that's what Jetsunpa means when they have the truth of origin. They could still bring result. They're waiting for their result. And there's so many stories in the traditional teachings of the Hinayana arhats experiencing suffering. For example, that one of the Buddha's close disciples, Moggallana, was murdered. And it was said very clearly in the story in the Vinaya about that it was the result of his karma. In fact, Moggallana was known to have supernatural powers, but because his karma to be murdered was so strong that when he tried to fly away, it didn't work. because the karma was pulling him down. So he was already an arhat, but it was still waiting to ripen. So then possible faults with this assertion. So I said, this is my assertion that is not all the totally conventional one. What would be the possible faults? So the Amitabha Samachaya states that ordinary beings in a pure land do not have true sufferings. So they cannot have true origins. Right? So that a being who's an ordinary being, not an Arya, is born in a pure land. And in Sukhavati mainly, that's the only place, pure land, that's understood where a non-Arya can be born. So they do not have true sufferings. They don't have, true origins have to be true sufferings. But they must have karmic imprints because they haven't abandoned them. They're still ordinary beings. And because they need to be born back in impure lands to achieve the path of seeing. It's understood that one can only achieve the path of seeing in an impure land. So if my assertion is the case, that the imprints are true origins, it would seem to not fit with this. That it would seem to imply that they have true origins but they can't. But my answer to that would be, but the Amitabha Samachaya explicitly says that the world and its beings in a pure land are not true suffering. So it does not say there is no true suffering. The explicit wording is the world and its beings are not true suffering. It does not say that the beings cannot have true suffering in their continua, it should say. So the person and their body, that is not true suffering. And the world that they exist in is not, but deep in their mind, they could still have true origins and true sufferings. And in order to be born back in impure lands, they must also have afflictions. And so if your assertion is that, well, they need the imprints to be born in impure lands again, and therefore those imprints cannot be true suffering or true origins, but they also have to have afflictions to be born back there. They have to have something to ripen the imprints. So you have to say they have some kind of true origin. Some people say they're already born by prayers, but even so, the prayers must ripen past imprints. Now you could argue whether the past imprints are not true origins, and neither are the prayers. So that would be one way to argue that. But at the same time, is it necessarily the case that they're born there by prayers? And how does it work to be reborn by prayers? Right? They're still ripening an impure imprint. So why is the imprint all of a sudden no longer the true origin? Then it cannot be the one of the 12 links of dependent origination. Then how can it ripen as anything? So a second possible thought with this assertion is that if that karmic imprint, like imprints of afflictions, is a knowledge obscuration, right? If that was the assertion, right? The imprints of afflictions are knowledge obscurations. That's understood. So if the imprints of karma were knowledge obscurations, then it wouldn't even disappear at remainderless nirvana. But that can't be right if it is a true origin, because at remainderless nirvana, you no longer have true suffering and therefore no true origin. My answer to that would be, if it is a knowledge obscuration, then hearers cannot abandon even a part of it. But hearers certainly can purify some karmic imprints. So I don't think the karmic imprints are knowledge obscurations in the same way that the afflictive imprints are. Okay, so we went a little over time, but fortunately, we do have a little time, and I don't mind staying later if that's what we need to do. We should have question and answer now. So I will finish the presentation here. That's the last slide. And then we can have time for question and answer. Maybe I have to assume that you all understood everything very clearly. I also expect maybe it was a little over some people's heads, at least the later slides. But nevertheless, if you have, even if it's more basic questions, please don't feel intimidated. As I said in the first talks, my goal here was to present some of the most difficult debates, because these are the kind of things you're not going to get when you're reading about these in the standard presentations. You can only get this sort of through the oral tradition. But at the same time, I think people might have more basic questions about the Four Noble Truths. So it's perfectly fine if people want to ask about those. Okay, I think somebody's talking, but it's very hard to hear.
Hi, can you hear me?
Oh, yeah, now I can hear you. Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, sorry, it's raining in Pomaya, which means we're having connections problems with the internet. I don't know if you have that with the monsoon, but that's what we're having.
Oh, well, monsoon is mostly done now, fortunately.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, one question. You mentioned there are only two kinds of obscurations, afflictive, cognitive. Okay.
Yes.
We're familiar with that. But then, and this has come up a lot, that you know, self-cherishing, which we talk of as something to be abandoned, is neither of those two, but yet is something that, you know, Lama Zopa Rinpoche is very keen we abandon.
Yeah,
so
of course.
How is that classified? And if it's not, yeah, it's an object of abandonment, but not an obscuration. So what do you put that in?
Okay. So there's a presentation of four objects of four obscurations. So in Tibetan, so Nyondrip, which is afflictive obscurations, and then Shedrip, cognitive or knowledge obscurations, and then Menpe Dripa, which is afflictions of inferiority, which is talking about Hinayana, which is self-cherishing. The Menpe Dripa is self-cherishing, and then Nyomdriki Dripa, which is obscurations to attaining the absorptions, the form and formless absorptions, and also the absorption of cessation. So that's a very clear answer to that the latter two are not actually obscurations. Now, what does that mean is a different question, but the answer is clear. That they're just called that because they're similar, but they're not actually obscurations. So we see these wordings, chok, what is it? Chok, man. For example, in Gyulama, the Uttara Tantra, it talks about the first three anyway. So chok tok min, that's what chok tok man sum, the three obscurations. So chok, which is attachment, that's talking about the obscuration of affliction, and then tok means obstruction, it's talking about the obscuration, the knowledge obscurations, and men, it's talking about the inferior, meaning the inferior thought, the thought for oneself, one's own personal benefit. But even there, it's not an obscuration in the general sense, because it's very clear in the text by the same author, Maitreya, in the Uta, the trading middle and extreme. There's only those two. So why is it presented that way? Well, it at least it does obscure, it does prevent us from obtaining liberation in the sense of Mahayana liberation. But it's not the main thing that does. Right, so it's a supporting thing of that, but it's also not. It's not like a attachment or anger, which are specific afflictions. They're rooted in the conception of a substantial self. So thereby, they are abandoned along with that. Whereas this self-cherishing, or the inferior obscuration, is not abandoned simply by abandoning the view of the self, nor is it abandoned alongside the by meditating on emptiness and Buddhahood, because it's abandoned before that. It's understood that one abandons that at the 8th bodhisattva ground. That's why in the Uttara Tantra, it gives the example of the comparison of the 8th bodhisattva ground to being emerging from the womb, where it's that before that one is polluted by the faults of the womb, which is an impure place in the system. And then when one emerges from that at the 8th bodhisattva ground, was a fully fledged, a pure ground bodhisattva. And that's what pure ground is talking about. At least one of the 3 things it's talking about is that they no longer have self-cherishing, the imprint of self-cherishing. Before that, it says they were still there was still a possibility, even though it's not possible, but there was still some doubt, or it's like they couldn't possibly have fallen to a Hinayana path because their bodhicitta is too strong. But there's still some, you could say that maybe some impulse to do so, even though they can resist it. At the 8th ground, that's no longer there. That's why the reality limit we talked about before. That's why it says that at the 8th ground, just before until they achieve the 8th ground, there's a danger of falling into the reality limit and actualizing that prematurely. After the 8th ground, that's no longer a problem because they've abandoned self-cherishing. They've also abandoned coarse effort, and they've abandoned a manifest conception of true existence. Those are the other 2 things that make it the pure ground. But anyway, likewise, coarse effort, likewise with self-cherishing. The point is that they are not rooted in wrong view per se. So they're not an obscuration that has to be rooted out by meditating on its opposite, the opposite engager, right? You have the wrong view of a substantial person. You have to meditate on the selflessness of a person. In terms of the self-cherishing, it's a habitual tendency. So it has to be gradually overcome through training in the opposite, but not necessarily through a cognitive understanding that is cultivated through meditation. It's actually probably more, although I haven't seen this specifically said, that it's probably more through one's behavior rather than through one's deep meditative state, that one gradually trains to not think of me and not just act for my own benefit. But beyond that, I could give speculation, but I haven't seen anything more in the text about that. But anyway, to your original question, yes, that it is called an affliction, and that's definitely the self-cherishing thought, dak chidin in Tibetan. But it's not. It's very clearly stated. This is not an actual affliction, nor is the affliction, or sorry, not an actual obscuration, nor is the obscuration to the higher concentrations in actual obscuration. It's just called that because it's similar in stopping the actualizing of them, but it's not based in a wrong view, right? It can only overcome through habituating with the higher concentrations. I guess also to answer your original question and your question about Lama Zob Rinpoche talking about this, that certainly it is a major obscuration or that's why we use the word obscuration, a major obstacle to entering the Mahayana path. So it's the thought that the Hinayana has of I want to achieve my own liberation. That's actually a path. That's a virtuous thought. It can be a true path. It's still self-cherishing. So it's not necessarily a bad thing in a strong sense. It's not non-virtuous, but it obstructs going on the path that we want to go on if we're going to practice Mahayana, and thereby it's the biggest obstacle to that, and so it has to be overcome through habituating with the opposite way of thinking or the opposite way of behaving. Yeah, I see you have still the connection problem. I'd heard about that. So I hope if you weren't able to hear the whole talk anyway, it should be recorded. And then if people are unable to ask questions now and they have other questions, I suppose it's fine that they can forward those. I can answer them by email later on. It was just the last question. Okay, so it's yeah. In any case, if people do have other questions, they're welcome to forward them later on. So I think, as I said at the beginning, it looks like this will be the last talk on Prajnaparamita, but we can think about what to do for Madhyamaka. In a lot of ways, it's easier, Madhyamaka, after all this complication of all these categories in Prajnaparamita. Debating Madhyamaka is like a breeze for 4 years. After we do 7 years of Prajnaparamita, and you get to Madhyamaka, and it's very relaxing in some sense. But if you're really trained well in this way of thinking through the Prajnaparamita study, then the debate in Madhyamaka just flows very well, because it makes a lot more sense what they're saying. Chandrakirti's presentation is very coherent and what do we say? Consistent. It doesn't seem like he's saying two different things, two different places. There are not that many points where it's not clear what he's talking about. At the same time, of course, trying to bring that into meditation and really understand the very subtle things. It's almost impossible to understand what Chandrakirti is saying without understanding what Bhaviveka is saying and understanding what the mind-only school is saying, because he's taking off as a kind of a reference point their views, and then how do we go more refined. So without understanding that, it's very unclear kind of what's the context of his conversation. But if we understand that, we can see by his pointing out the subtle flaws in their views. For example, this thing I just talked about, this debate that I was having with Romuald Rinpoche about whether the illustration for the person is that actual person. That is a major problem if you say that an illustration of a person is a person. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense if they say that a mental consciousness is the person. But if you don't say that, you don't have that problem. You don't have to answer either way. And then in Chandrakirti's view, it makes a lot more sense when we see that. The mental consciousness cannot be a person because all these faults ensue. We already know why. So we can't say that when we really get down to it, I am just mental and purely mental, which is what a lot of people sometimes will say if they have trained in some degree of spiritual practice. They'll say that ultimately everything in the world is mind, and it just flows on from mind, and I am really just pure consciousness. Similar, again, to the Samkhya that we were talking about earlier. That's just one example. But anyway, and Madhyamaka is the most enjoyable time here in the monastery. Now we've moved on to Vinaya, which is its own kind of a purification process, I guess, purgatory. Just about finished finally, the big relief. But it's actually, I'd recommend it to anyone, especially, I guess, only really for those of you who are ordained. But Vinaya is exceptional. I was pleasantly surprised. I did not expect it to be so relevant, given what some people sometimes think about it. That's just an aside. But all of these subjects are quite amazing. These Indian scholars, and then of course the Tibetans later writing about them. These were very thoughtful people, even though they lived in a very different context. They were not easily misled, I would say. So, okay, why don't, again, assuming there's no more questions, why don't we stop there? And I will thank you all for attending. It was very nice to be able to put this together. It helps me a lot also to think about these things again and to try to explain them to an audience that's not taking for granted a lot of the points we take for granted here in these debates. So I have to think more about what does it really mean. So I appreciate that and look forward to discussing Madhyamaka in the future. Okay, thank you.